In the final hours before dawn on April 9, 1942, silence settled uneasily over the shattered defenses of the Bataan Peninsula. The guns that had thundered for months fell quiet, not because victory had been achieved, but because there was nothing left to fire them with. Along the jungle-covered ridges and foxholes soaked by rain and sweat, American and Filipino soldiers waited in exhaustion, many barely conscious, their bodies hollowed by hunger, disease, and despair. For them, the battle for Bataan was over, but what awaited them next would become one of the most infamous atrocities in American military history. This was the beginning of the Bataan Death March, a journey that would transform defeat into prolonged suffering and survival into a matter of brutal chance. The roots of the tragedy stretched back to December 1941, when the Empire of Japan unleashed a lightning campaign across the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th stunned the United States, but the Philippines were struck almost simultaneously. Japanese bombers roared over Clark Field and other air bases on Luzon, destroying much of the American Air Force while it sat lined up on the ground. The sky belonged to Japan almost immediately, and with air superiority secured, Japanese invasion forces moved swiftly toward their next objective. At the time, the Philippines were an American commonwealth, promised eventual independence, but still under U.S. military protection. General Douglas MacArthur commanded U.S. Army forces in the Far East, a mixed force of American regulars, Philippine scouts, and tens of thousands of Filipino reservists. On paper, the numbers looked formidable. In reality, the Army was ill-equipped, undertrained, and critically short of modern weapons. Many Filipino soldiers had received only basic instruction and carried outdated rifles. Artillery ammunition was limited, anti-aircraft defenses were insufficient, and most importantly, the defenders were about to be cut off from reinforcement. As Japanese troops landed on Luzon in December 1941 under the command of Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa, MacArthur activated War Plan Orange, a pre-war strategy that called for a fighting withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula and the fortified island of Corregidor. The idea was simple and desperate: hold out long enough for the U.S. Navy to arrive and relieve the garrison. But Pearl Harbor had crippled that fleet, and the relief force would never come. By January 1942, the defenders of Bataan were already living on borrowed time. Supply depots were destroyed or abandoned during the retreat. Food stocks dwindled rapidly. Rations were cut in half, then halved again. Eventually, soldiers were surviving on as little as one meal a day, often nothing more than a handful of rice or canned meat shared among several men. Protein deficiency weakened muscles. Vitamin shortages caused swelling, blindness, and mental fog. Malaria swept through the ranks, carried by mosquitoes that thrived in the jungle heat. Dysentery left men dehydrated and barely able to stand. Yet, despite these conditions, the American and Filipino forces continued to fight. For 3 brutal months, they delayed the Japanese advance, inflicting significant casualties and forcing Homa to pause his offensive and request reinforcements. It was one of the most stubborn defensive actions of the early Pacific War, and it came at a terrible cost. By March 1942, many frontline units were combat ineffective. Soldiers collapsed in their trenches, too weak to lift their rifles. Hospitals overflowed with the sick and wounded, lacking medicine, bandages, and even clean water. On March 11, 1942, General MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines and escape to Australia. His departure was controversial, but he promised, "I shall return." Command passed to Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, while Major General Edward King, Jr. assumed responsibility for the collapsing Bataan defense. King quickly realized the truth that few wanted to admit. The Army could not continue. Ammunition was nearly gone, food was almost exhausted, Thousands of men lay incapacitated. Continuing to fight would mean slaughter. Faced with this reality, General King made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On April 9, 1942, he surrendered the forces on Bataan to the Japanese. It was the largest surrender in American history. Approximately 75,000 to 80,000 soldiers laid down their arms, including about 12,000 Americans and more than 60,000 Filipinos. Many believed that surrender, however humiliating, would spare their lives. They believed they would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. That belief would be shattered almost immediately. The Japanese command had not expected such a massive capitulation. They were logistically unprepared to handle tens of thousands of prisoners. More critically, the culture of the Imperial Japanese Army regarded surrender as disgraceful. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated to believe that capture was worse than death, and that those who surrendered forfeited their honor and their right to humane treatment. This mindset, combined with frustration, exhaustion, and racial contempt, created a deadly environment for the captives. Within hours of the surrender, Japanese guards began herding prisoners northward from the southern tip of Bataan at Mariveles and Bagak. Their destination was Camp O'Donnell, a former Philippine Army training facility more than 65 miles away. There was no organized transport, no food was distributed, water was scarce, medical personnel were separated or ignored. The prisoners, many already at the edge of death, were ordered to march. The march began under a blazing tropical sun. Temperatures soared. The road shimmered with heat. Men stumbled forward in columns, their boots worn through, their feet blistered and bleeding. Those who fell behind were beaten with rifle butts, bamboo poles, or fists. If they could not rise, they were often bayoneted or shot. Bodies were left where they fell, unburied, lining the road as grim markers of what awaited anyone who could not keep up. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes of shocking brutality. Prisoners who broke ranks to drink from roadside streams or wells were executed on the spot. Japanese guards poured water on the ground in front of dying men, then laughed as they watched them crawl toward it. Lectins deliberately swerved into columns of prisoners, crushing men beneath their wheels. Some guards forced prisoners to dig their own graves before killing them. One of the most infamous punishments was known as the sun treatment. Prisoners were forced to sit or stand in the open for hours without shade or water, sometimes as punishment, sometimes simply for the guards' amusement. Men collapsed from heat stroke, their skin blistered, their eyes glazed. Medical officers and chaplains, who should have been protected under the laws of war, were beaten and killed alongside enlisted men. Filipino soldiers often suffered even worse treatment. Viewed as traitors for resisting Japanese rule, many were beaten or executed without provocation. Entire groups were massacred during the march, their deaths unrecorded and forgotten except in survivor testimony. American officers, too, were singled out. Some were beheaded or shot simply for wearing insignia. Among the prisoners was Captain William E. Dias, an American airman whose later writings would become one of the most detailed accounts of the march. He described guards killing prisoners casually, as if killing livestock. Lieutenant Robert Shepard recalled watching men beaten to death for moving too slowly. Medics were powerless to help the wounded, forced to march past dying comrades, knowing they could do nothing. As days passed, the death toll mounted relentlessly. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipino prisoners and at least 600 American prisoners died during the march itself. Many more were wounded or permanently disabled. The road from Bataan became a corridor of death, littered with corpses and soaked with suffering.
When survivors finally reached San Fernando, they believed the ordeal was over. Instead, they were herded into railway boxcars designed to carry cargo, not human beings. Known as 40 and 8 cars, they were meant for 40 men or 8 horses. Japanese guards packed over 100 prisoners into each car. With no ventilation and no water, the cars became ovens. Men suffocated, collapsed, and died standing up, crushed against one another as the train lurched northward. From the railhead, the survivors were forced to march again, this time to Camp O'Donnell. There, another nightmare awaited. The camp was unprepared, overcrowded, and filthy. Sanitation was non-existent, clean water was scarce, medical supplies were virtually absent. Dysentery, malaria, and typhoid claimed lives daily. Bodies were stacked near the camp hospital, sometimes left for days before burial. Burial details themselves often died while performing their grim work.
Camp O'Donnell quickly became a death camp. Within weeks, thousands perished. American doctors, themselves prisoners, tried desperately to treat the sick with no medicine and no equipment. They improvised bandages from scraps of cloth. They diagnosed illness knowing they could not cure it. The dead were so numerous that counting them became impossible. Eventually, conditions improved slightly as prisoners were transferred to other camps and work details. But the damage had been done. Tens of thousands were dead. Survivors were skeletal, haunted, and broken in ways that could not be measured. News of the Bataan Death March reached the United States slowly. Censorship, confusion, and the chaos of war delayed the truth. But when reports emerged through escaped prisoners and Filipino guerrillas, the reaction was fury. Remember Bataan became a rallying cry across America, fueling enlistment, war bond drives, and a determination to defeat Japan at any cost. For General Masaharu Homma, the commander responsible for the invasion, the war would end in disgrace. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Homma was arrested and tried by an American military tribunal in Manila. He claimed he had lost control of his troops and was unaware of the atrocities. The court rejected his defense. He was found guilty of war crimes related to the Death March and the mistreatment of prisoners. On April 3, 1946, Homma was executed by firing squad. For the survivors, liberation did not bring peace. Many returned home with shattered health, unable to work, plagued by chronic illness and nightmares. Some struggled for decades to speak of what they had endured. Others dedicated their lives to ensuring that the memory of Bataan would never fade. Their testimony ensured that the march would not be dismissed as a footnote, but remembered as a warning. Today, the Bataan Death March stands as one of the most harrowing episodes of World War II. It was not merely a failure of logistics or leadership, it was a collapse of humanity. It revealed how ideology, dehumanization, and war can turn ordinary men into instruments of cruelty. It also revealed extraordinary endurance, as thousands survived against all odds, carrying the memory of those who did not. The road from Bataan is quiet now. The jungle has reclaimed much of it, but the echoes remain. In the footsteps of the starving, the dying, and the dead, there is a lesson written in suffering. That lesson is simple and unforgiving. War does not end when the fighting stops. Sometimes its darkest chapter begins only after the guns fall silent.